again, at this point, people were not image bearers of God. Not yet, in my mind. Women especially were products for my own satisfaction. I'd use and throw them away when I was done with them. I had the mentality of seeing them as a car. Like you hear that really stupid adage that people say in our culture all the time. You got to test drive it before you buy it. Like what an empty, worthless, misogynistic, pathetic, dangerous little weak boy thing to say and way of looking at women, who are image bearers of God. The ones that real men should be protecting from people like who I was. The saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. That is 1 Timothy 1:15, and today's episode is anchored in Paul's words here in this book. This particular verse resonates deeply with me and who I was before Christ and captures exactly what this episode is about. Welcome back, everybody, to Campfire Apologetics. I am Mark Hudson, and today's episode is going to be about my testimony. I believe personal testimonies, although subjective, can carry some powerful apologetic weight. And that's not ultimate proof of Christianity, but when personal experience aligns with the objective truth of Scripture, the alignment becomes a powerful confirmation. And this is what I'm aiming at in sharing this. So if our experiences align with God's word, and God is ultimate reality and has revealed to us who he is in his word, then I think it stands as a more powerful testimony. I want to break this episode up into parts for the sake of flow and hopefully timing. The first part is going to be kind of talking about my foundations. I'll cover some things from my childhood and early exposure to religion and some broken family dynamics. And then I'll move to what I call formation. And in that section, I'll talk about music in my life, growing anger, rebellion, and peer influences. Then I'll speak on my fallenness, which will cover sexual sin, objectification, drinking, and spiritual emptiness. The ache for something more, essentially. The emptiness of the lifestyle I was living and the inconsistencies in my worldview. That's essentially where we'll end up there. And before we get into it, hopefully this won't be super long. I tried to break this down in a way that I can share all these things in a timely fashion. And you'll notice that even though it is my testimony, it is my own life story, my own experiences, that I am still reading or reading from a transcript. And that's because I tend to express my thoughts much better when I write them, and reading them will really keep me on track and hopefully save some time. So yeah, we can get into it. When it comes to testimonies, the question is always, where do I even begin, right? That's kind of always the daunting question of testimonies, or so it seems. Sometimes you really only have 5 minutes, or you don't really have a whole lot of time to give a so many details in such a condensed space of time, or such a small space of time. And so this will be somewhat condensed, because obviously I'm not going to be able to cover 38 years of history in even a half an hour. But I'll do my best. So it'll be a little more than an elevator pitch, but luckily it's my show, and really I can do what I want, and you can you can stay or you can leave. So that's up to you. But for those of you interested, I would stay. So I'll start with as early as I can remember. I wouldn't really say that I was raised Christian. Now, I don't know how my parents would take that, but my understanding of Christianity now, after studying the word and just seeing what the Christian life looks like, I would say I was not raised in a Christian house. My parents might say that I was. I'm really not sure how they would go about that, but I wasn't raised really with the understanding that following Jesus was a lifestyle, or that following Jesus would foster change or transformation of any kind. I had an understanding of Jesus and some biblical concepts that I learned from random trips to church and Sunday school, but nothing that I would consider robust by any means. And most of my church experience, at least from what I can remember, was when I would go with my mom to her church. Now, I did go with my parents to their church for a while, but I think the more memorable experiences were, when my grandmom, or mom is what I call her, she would pick us up in the morning and take us to hers. But most of the time, I probably didn't have a choice anyway. But I was usually excited, and probably not because of learning the word or learning anything about God or Jesus, but because I knew that she would take us to the Wendy's that was right next door to the church, and she would get us Frosties afterwards. And so my excitement was driven more by frozen chocolatey treats than learning about God. Again, I also did attend church where my parents went for a while. I want to say that was more in my teen years, um, or closer to that time. But honestly, a lot of my childhood was it was pretty normal for the most part. I would gallivant around my neighborhood for the time I woke up, or from the time that I woke up until the street lights came on. If you're a 90s kid, you know exactly what that means. You know that the street lights meant it was time to come home. My parents didn't, they probably didn't know where I was half the time, if I'm being honest. Much different from today's world. Now we get scared when somebody knocks on our door. You have to make sure your Glock is loaded, before peeking out of your little side window next to your front door, to make sure it's somebody you actually know, or it's not somebody trying to rob you or kill you, or even worse, a Jehovah's Witness. I'm totally kidding. For for any Jehovah's Witnesses that might have come across this, I'm just kidding. I would much rather talk to you than deal with somebody trying to rob or kill me. But as far as like things you would watch growing up, cartoons or TV shows, or whatever, there's a lot of there were a lot of different things that I came across growing up where kids weren't allowed to watch certain things, and that was really never a thing for me. I mean, there were definitely some things that I definitely they were off limits, but for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot that I wasn't allowed to watch or listen to. There was a few, but I always found a way anyway. That's what kids do, right? They kind of all do. Uh, the more you're told not to do something, the harder you work at finding a way to do that thing. So the natural rebellion, right? It was strong. But there's much more to my childhood, but a lot of those details probably aren't really important for the purpose of sharing my testimony and how I came to know Jesus. So I'll move on to the next section of what I call formation, like I said in the beginning. And this kind of begins with my love for music, and that began pretty early on. I started playing music and listening to music regularly on a very, or at a very early age. I was probably Oh gosh, I just realized what I have here. I was probably 6 or 7. Um, not for the stupid trendy meme thing. I was actually around that age. So, um, if your kids ever hear you watching this episode and they look at you, 6, 7. Sorry, I think I said that in the last episode too. I'm just like, you just hear it so much now. It's now I'm even cognizant when I see those numbers. I'm like, oh gosh, I don't even want to say it. But I was around that age when I first started playing drums. I specifically remember playing the beat to "We Will Rock You" by Queen, and I also remember singing the melody at the same time. I, I I don't know why, but I distinctly remember playing the drum beat and singing the song at the same time. And people always ask me how I play drums and sing at the same time because in a lot of bands that I was in, I there were times where I would sing leads as a drummer. And my answer is I really don't know. Apparently, it was pretty natural for me from the start. So it wasn't necessarily something that I had to really learn how to do. It was just something that I did automatically when I first started playing. So um, I guess that's my answer. I don't know anything different if I'm being honest. So soon after starting drums, I also took an interest in playing guitar. I would bring my black and white Squire Stratocaster, the little crappy beginner one that probably most people had in the 90s at least. I'm not really sure what they start with today, but I would bring that to my best friend's house almost every day, and we would try to learn Metallica songs, most notably King Nothing. We were together all day, every day, me and him, Max. Whether it was playing music, listening to music, watching movies we probably shouldn't have been watching, hitting carpenter bees with baseball bats in his backyard as we were, or, pretending like we were Chipper Jones or Ken Griffey Jr., we were inseparable. And that is until I moved about 20 minutes away south. And shortly after that, he moved as well. But after I turned 10, my best friend, again, Max, his name was Max. It's actually Brennan, but for some reason they called him Max. I'm not really sure why. But soon after I moved, he moved to Florida, or at least that's where his mom said that they were moving. But little did I know that this would be the trajectory for a lot of patterns in my life to come later. That was the first big loss that I felt. Now, he didn't die, but he might as well had. I completely lost contact with him and I never saw him again. I still find myself to this day searching Facebook and other social media platforms to see if I can find him, and still no luck. And maybe you know him. I don't know. His name's Brennan Smith. He goes by Max. He probably still goes by that. But looking back at this moment, I can now see that his moving away has affected me more than I could really have ever imagined at the time. At the time, everything's hindsight's 2020. You really don't think much about things when they first happen, or you do think about them, but you don't think about how they will affect you in the future. But eventually, as I grew, I started to become more aware of my surroundings, and I started to feel really kind of the weight of the world around me. I started to understand what was actually happening in my own life and in my home. The innocence was kind of leaving me. My parents are both great, and I love them both to death. So this isn't to make them look bad or anything like that. I'm simply just telling my story, and nobody is perfect. Like, there's not a perfect parent out there. Lord knows I'm not. Like, I have 2 kids, and I fail. I probably fail them daily. Okay, so I'm not some shining example of you know of humanity or parenthood. But this is just an episode that that'll I mean, this episode will show you that, as I get into these things. This episode will be a testament to the fact that I am really fallen. Uh, if anything, I understand even more now as a parent the stress and weight that my parents had, as I grew up. Things get tough, money gets tight, you get behind on bills, you start feeling like you aren't doing enough to support your family. The stress is real. I mean, it goes on and on. But I grew up around a lot of anger. There was a lot of tension, there was a lot of yelling. It wasn't really it wasn't a fully broken home, but it oftentimes felt like one. My dad, he liked to drink, and my mom hated it, and this oftentimes didn't end well. There were times I remember my dad leaving for days at a time, then returning home to avoid my mom for a while, and until they both, uh, they said sorry and swept it under the rug, or sometimes they didn't even say anything to each other. They just started talking again. Um, I think this is probably the springboard for my anger issues when I was younger. I was actually diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder. I would go from 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds. Just, ask the walls and doors of my parents' house. I even broke bones from outbursts of anger. Nothing super major, but a toe, a finger, a boxer break from punching a metal garage door. The garage door won, so I grew very resentful and hateful, uh, really toward a lot of things, especially that garage door. I started to hang out with people that would fuel that fire. People that were a lot like me. They were angry, and it just fueled everything that I had already felt and kind of encouraged the behaviors. But um, I had a good friend in high school who was actually for lack of better terms, I think it's safe to say he was actually like a Nazi sympathizer. I really didn't know this at the time, nor did I even really understand what that meant. But all of the pieces were there, and the influence of hatred definitely rubbed off on me. I became the person who hated anyone who wasn't like me. I used language that would get me killed in the wrong places. It wasn't until I realized later that there is only one race. So, you could put the pieces together and you can understand what I'm saying here. It was later on when I really truly realized that there really is only one race, and that is the human race, and every person is made in the image of God and is deserving of love and respect and dignity. Only the Christian worldview could give me that foundation to understand this. And everything else was arbitrary and not grounded in anything objective that would point to anything that would say that we ought to do anything at all. This revelation, however, did not come until much later in my life. It was around the age of either 15 or 16 that I joined my first band. We were called Bombs Away. We were a pop punk band, and we were heavily influenced by the likes of bands like Green Day and Punchline and Brand New and Newfound Glory, things like that. And this was kind of the trajectory that put me on my way to the sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle, right? It was hard to avoid talking about anything deeply personal or deeply personal issues as a hormonal teen sharing most of my waking hours with others who were in the same boat. All the other guys in the band were around my age, except for one guy. He was always the old fart. Still is. See that? If you're watching this, you know who you are. You're old. I soon found out that I was the only one in the band at this time who was a virgin. And it sounds really stupid, right? But in our over sexualized culture, it was a big deal. A level of embarrassment was always kind of looming, like why was I different than all the other guys? Why hadn't I kept up with the cool kids? Of course, I couldn't keep going on that way. I had to catch up so I could contribute to the often had conversations in the group and be cool, be one of the guys, truly be one of them and truly fit in. So from that point, I was on a mission, and it wasn't very hard to achieve my goals as a teen in a band that was pretty popular in my area, where I live. I'd say kind of opened up. It just opened a can of worms. I became a useless and dangerous member of society for myself and others. And this probably doesn't sound like a big deal to most people in our culture, but the amount of people that I hurt in the long run, to me, just really isn't acceptable. Again, at this point, people were not image bearers of God, not yet in my mind. Women, especially, were products for my own satisfaction. I'd use and throw them away when I was done with them. I had the mentality of seeing them as a car. Like you hear that really stupid adage that people say in our culture all the time: you got to test drive it before you buy it. Like what an empty, worthless, misogynistic, pathetic, dangerous little weak boy thing to say and way of looking at women, who are image bearers of God. The ones that real men should be protecting from people like who I was. I have a hard time thinking back because I just can't help but be honestly disgusted. But I thank God that his grace reaches this far and he forgives the broken sinner I was and restores what I broke. I once broke up with a girlfriend and challenged myself to see if I could sleep with a different woman every day for a week. Um, I don't know why I did that. It's just, it was just something that my awesome, teen mind came up with, and that's what I ran with. So, but and even further, a friend of mine and I, we entered into a contest with one another to see how many girls, women, whatever you want to call it, we could sleep with in a certain period of time. We'd tally up the numbers at the end, winner takes all. What did we take exactly? Well, I don't know. Nothing other than digging ourselves further into sin and sexual debasement and, our own just terrible thoughts. Romans 1 says, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. We would, the approval part is what really sticks out to me. Not that the other parts don't stick out to me, because it's all very important, but the approval part, that's what sticks out to me, because we would all encourage each other to go further. We would, keep drinking and see how many women you can get under your belt, right? Like they were just notches on a belt. The band also had a member who was of age. That's the old guy, to be able to purchase alcohol. No, so honestly, I drank more as a teen than after I turned 21. It had lost its luster at that point. I turned 21 and went to the bars for a little bit, and it just got old really fast. And it's like I could just drink at home with some friends for a lot less money and not be surrounded by a bunch of people that I can't stand. So why wouldn't I just do that? It wasn't even cool anymore to drink once I was actually allowed to. That kind of goes back into that, just the rebellious mindset that you want to do the things that you're not supposed to do. But that band, we pretty much played every weekend, and on many occasions did week-long tours. We would kind of go up and down the East Coast. We were actually gaining some traction, and we were building a decent fan base. The momentum seemingly came to a halt once our guitar player and singer Mac, not Max, but Mac. It's kind of goofy that two of my earlier best friends were so similar in name. His name was Malcolm, but Mac. He went by Mac, and he unexpectedly passed away. He was 19. Him and I actually shared a birthday, and again, he was one of my closest friends. He was the guy I could call anytime, day or night. 3 in the morning, I could call him. He would answer. But he was really good at hiding his addiction. We all knew that he had issues, but I don't think any of us knew how bad it was. One night he mixed one too many things, and what he probably didn't realize was a lethal cocktail of alcohol and pain medications, and he didn't wake up. And this that hit me hard. He passed in 2005. It's now 2025. And 20 years later, and there still isn't a day really that passes that I don't think about him. And the loss didn't end there. Just 5 years after Max passing, I got news that one of my best friends from high school, Jared, had been killed in a car accident. A year later, after that, another great friend of mine, we called him Beaver. A lot of my friends had nicknames, but we called him Beaver. His name was Chris. He died from an overdose. He was like a brother to me. He actually lived at my parents' house with our family. He had a pretty rough upbringing, and so my parents, we took him in, and my parents treated him like one of their own. He had his own stocking for Christmas. They would buy him presents for Christmas and put stuff in his stocking that was actually labeled for him. They would include him in the grocery list. Whatever he wanted from the store, they would get him. Like whatever he needed for the week. He was another one of my parents' kids, essentially. He got caught up in the wrong people, and we really didn't know it. His behavior started to change a lot. Things started to go missing from our house, and we started to grow a little bit suspicious. Nobody really wanted to go there. Nobody wanted to say, maybe it's Chris. Like, why are all these things going missing? What's going on? And soon after we started to suspect something was going on, he was gone. It was becoming a trend almost. Our whole group started to wonder who was next. It was almost expected at this point. Like, we all came to a point in our lives when we realize we are finite and that we all have a date with death. I mean, 10 out of 10 people die. I don't know if you knew that, but every single person has an expiration date, and death does not discriminate. Some people come to this realization earlier than others, but everyone at some point reaches that point where they begin to ask the big questions. Why am I here? Who am I? What happens when we die? All of those things. Well, this impact event was when I started to ask these questions. I started losing people at a pretty young age. I was angry and I was deeply depressed. Honestly, I didn't want to turn to God. If anything, I would have probably blamed him. I spent a lot of time with my own thoughts, which is probably never a good thing. And this hurt and pain, it didn't go away for a long time, and it still looms from time to time. But there even came a point, and that it's not easy to say. It's really not. But there did come a point where I was certain I would take my own life. I just didn't know how or when I would do it. I had these thoughts even after having kids. That's awful. I felt like my depression was keeping me from being a good father and husband. I had it in my head that my wife and kids would be honestly better off without me. Mind you, the wife and kids are after I got saved. So I was saved at this point, and I still had these these crazy thoughts. But more on that later, right? But deep introspection eventually led to asking a lot of questions about God and faith that needed to be answered. There were challenging questions that required a strong apologetic mind to tackle. Questions of origins and sin and salvation, who is Jesus, um, etc. It goes on. God ultimately used apologetics to draw me in. I guess that's just how my mind works. I'm kind of analytical, and God knows this, and He used this as the vehicle to bring me to salvation, um, or to bring me to Him. And the questions were many. Even until today, I still have questions. I mean, you never not, or you never end with the line of questions. They're endless. They continue on because you're always learning. You're always learning about God. Um, And I think that makes sense when you're trying to understand the infinite, all knowing mind of God. We should expect these questions, honestly, to never end. It's like you can't ever personally know everything there is to know. Uh, he's perfect and transcendent and infinite, and we are not. So we should never expect to come to a place in time and say, I got it. I got it all figured out. But really, I knew that there was something missing. I believe everyone has a God-shaped hole in their heart, and no one is truly content until they come to this realization and they accept and they walk with Christ. I think it's apparent when we look at all the different celebrities who seemingly have the world at their fingertips and still commit suicide because of the emptiness they experience in their lives when they finally reach the peak of their career. They have everything, and yet it still isn't enough. They still aren't fulfilled. Um, I heard somebody say one time that some people are so poor, all they have is money, and that stuck with me. But that was me. Not the money part, like that's never been a thing, but just the fact that I had so many things. I had so many good things. It didn't matter how hard I partied. It didn't matter how many women I got to hook up with, how many shows I got to play, how many people liked my band. It didn't matter that I ended up in a full-time touring band on a record label at one point. I still wanted to kill myself, and I believe it's because I was looking for fulfillment in all of my own ways and not in the way that God had intended. My identity was in my band and how many women I could sexually conquer. I was made for a home that I didn't have directions to. Here's the thing though. We can't truly know who we are or what our identity is or what it's supposed to be if we reject the one who has made us for a specific purpose. If a manufacturer of a company has a patent for a product that tells us exactly what the product is and how it should be used, and we disregard that, we may never get the full benefits of that product. You can use a butter knife as a screwdriver or a pry bar for something that doesn't require much strength, a hammer for a small nail, but none of those things are the knife's intended use. So how do we know exactly what the knife was made for? We go back to who invented it. We look at the original design and intent. We can do all kinds of things with our own, or on our own and with our own minds, but we still miss out on our true purpose if we don't go to the one who's made us. So there was a God-shaped hole in my life, but I didn't know that it was God that I needed to fill that void. I didn't know anything that could fill it, honestly. I mean, that's why in my mind I went to that place like I'm going to end things eventually. I just don't know when or how or where or any of the details. But God wasn't my first choice. I kind of just drifted along for a while. Mind you, I would have probably called myself a Christian most of the time that I was living this life. Most of the time that I was playing music and living in just complete sin, sleeping around, doing drugs. I mean, whatever, drinking, everything. I probably, if you were to ask me, I probably would have said that I was a Christian. Um, but clearly was not. There was a church that I used to go to that had, well, I didn't attend the church, but I would go there because they had bands play. It was like a local venue. I went there frequently with my brother when we were in middle and high school, and they had some really good bands come through. Like even Under Oath played there before anybody knew who they were. I mean, that's when they were like super young and they were touring. They didn't have a label. They didn't have any of that stuff. Literally nobody knew who they were, but they played there. I wasn't there for that show, but they were still at this venue. But we would go because it was a place for teens to hang out, and there were bands playing, and we liked music, so it just made sense. We didn't really care that much that it was a church. There was music, there was other kids, and there was a Papa John's next door. So what more did we need? Now I'm bringing this church up to kind of set the stage for the next part. We both stopped going after a while. Me and my brother, like we didn't really go to that venue, after quite a while. Everything kind of loses its fun, I guess. But once I joined a band, I was busy with my own shows and hanging with my own friends. So I'm sure that I'm not sure anyway when or why my brother stopped going, but that's irrelevant. We weren't even sure if the church was still there. Years had passed, and later on, though, I saw a flyer for a band that I really liked, called Becoming the Archetype, and they were coming to a close venue near me. And when I looked up the venue, it was the same name of the church that we used to go to see these bands play. And but I wasn't sure if it was the same church or not. It was called Crossroads. So there's a bunch of those. There's a bunch of churches called Crossroads. So it could have been any church, but this one was in a different location. So I was thinking that maybe it wasn't the same church, because I thought that the old one had just stayed where they were. But I went to the show, and lo and behold, it was all the same people. The church had just moved locations, and they were still putting on shows. Now, this was exciting because at the time I was becoming more interested in the idea of actually attending a church. Now, again, this is much later on. When I was going to that church to see bands play, I was like in my teens. This later show that I'm talking about was much later on. I was, well, maybe not like much later on, but I wasn't a teen anymore. I was definitely more grown and started showing more interest in church. So I started going to Crossroads. My girlfriend at the time, who is my wife now, was a bit turned off to the whole thing. She was raised Catholic, and she had a bad taste in her mouth about church and religion. So I went by myself for a bit until eventually she decided to go with me after I guess, talked her into it. But after attending church for some time, the pastor and a friend who played guitar at the church, he asked me if I wanted to play drums for a project that was going to be playing at Cornerstone Festival in Illinois. So, of course, I obliged. Cornerstone was it was a really big Christian music festival, and a lot of my favorite bands at the time were playing there, and I got to play, so it was a win-win for me, right? So this festival is where I realized that what it meant really to truly accept Christ and to walk with him. Up to that point, I really just had this general, I believe in God, so I'm saved attitude. I watched one of my favorite bands at the time, For Today, and if you watched, I think it was my last episode. Yeah, I don't know. I lose track. I think it was my last episode. I actually interviewed the vocalist of For Today on that episode. So check that out. I think it was a really good conversation. But I saw that band give an interview and they kind of talk about their testimonies and their lives a little bit. And afterward, anyway, I was able to talk with them and ask them for prayer. And I was just feeling this deep kind of stirring inside of me that just things weren't right, and I needed something. Like I knew that God was calling me at this point, and I was like, okay, I need to submit to Christ, and so I'm going to ask these guys for prayer. I could have asked anybody for prayer, but I was younger and I was very impressionable, and this band was talking, and I was in the music world, and I was just very heavily influenced by them, and it was just awesome to hear them talk and all the things they had to say. And so I asked them for prayer, and they gathered around me and they prayed for me, and it was really at that moment that uh, it's like I felt like there was this like physical weight that was lifted from my life. I really can't explain the feeling. It was just so personal, it's it's anecdotal, right? But it was just a very personal experience that I can't really fully explain. But it was kind of almost like a somewhat of an outer body experience, or like I was like floating in a sense, or I just felt weightless. I mean, I didn't have like any kind of image of myself from above or anything like that. It wasn't some kind of super strange happening or anything like that. I don't know. It was just a different sensation altogether. Um, but I'd realized that I had really not been living for God up to that point. I was going to church, but I was still drinking, and when I say drinking, I don't mean like I was having a beer with dinner and I was just kind of or having like a glass of bourbon or something with dinner, or sitting down with some friends enjoying some drinks. Like that's not what I mean. I mean like I was, looking forward to the weekend because I could party. I could drink to get drunk, right? I was on a mission. So but at that point I was still doing that. I was still having premarital sex. I was not reading the word or really praying. I needed to repent, and I needed to really turn to Jesus, and I called my girlfriend at the time. Again, she is my wife now. And I told her the experience I had. And I wasn't sure if the conversation would end the relationship or not, but I knew what I had to do. Like I said, she had been attending church with me for a bit. So this call wasn't completely out of the blue, but I told her that we couldn't continue to live like a married couple, if you know what I mean, and do the things that married people do until we were married. And a lot of relationships in America would end over a conversation like this because we live again in an overly sexualized culture, and everything is based around that. But it's like sex is the only factor that people seem to take into consideration when it comes to a relationship. But luckily it worked out, and she apparently grew more respect and attraction to me because of this conversation. So um the conversation kind of ended up doing the opposite of what I had expected. But part of the reason I wanted to go to Cornerstone Festival was also to network, meet people, and hand out my information in hopes of landing a gig with a signed and touring band. I would hand out my information everywhere I went, like local shows, festivals, work, etc., whatever, wherever I met people that played music. And eventually, after years of promoting myself, I got a random call from a number that I wasn't familiar with. They left a voicemail, and I listened to the voicemail, and it was this guy, Kramer, from a band in North Carolina called Onward to Olympus. This was in December 2011. He said that their drummer was quitting and wouldn't be able to do the next tour that was starting in 2 weeks. So I quit my job and I learned their set list. I traveled to North Carolina to practice with them before hitting the road, and they asked me to join the band, to which I said yes. Now, they asked me to join. This wasn't right away. They asked me to join the band, like kind of, I want to say it was probably toward the end of the tour, the first tour, but I recorded drums on their latest, or not latest, but their last record, which was called Indicator. I finally did it. I was in a signed and touring band. And again, no, I was not rich. We lived on like $5 a day for food. So this was when dollar menus actually still existed. I was I was blessed though, and it was an amazing experience, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. I met some of the greatest people I know while touring, many of which I still talk to. They're close friends of mine, and after about 2.5 years of touring, I think the guitar player said that him and his wife wanted to start trying to have kids. I was planning on proposing to my girlfriend, and everyone else seemed to kind of be going in, a different direction as well. So the band ended, and I had some other opportunities with some other bands. But if I wanted to get married, I needed something that was financially stable, and touring just wasn't. And if I had stuck it out, I'm sure I would have probably gotten to the point where I could pay the bills. But in turn, I would never be home, and that doesn't make marriage or raising kids easy. It makes it pretty difficult, and so I just didn't feel like that was the path that I was kind of being called down anymore. And so I turned down a lot of offers. Well, not a lot. It wasn't like people were calling me left and right, but I had a few, and I turned them down. And there were some pretty good offers. There were some pretty well known bands, but I turned them down because I would have been in the same situation, and I needed to get a job to support my wife and kids to come in the future. So, but you know, before I proposed, um, I had one more obstacle that I needed to face. When I was living my life of licentiousness, I got blackout drunk, and I cheated on my girlfriend, who is my wife now. She likes to say that we weren't in a great place and might have actually been on a break or broken up at the time. Uh, Maybe, I don't know. I I can't remember. It was a long time ago, but maybe she's just being nice, or maybe that's her way of being able to actually forgive me. But uh, it might be true that we weren't in a good place, because we oftentimes weren't. But I'm pretty positive, from my own memory anyway. I'm pretty sure we were still together. Um, but cheating on her is by far the one thing in my life that has made me feel worse than anything that I have ever done. I had anxiety attacks because of it. I couldn't sleep half the time, and this went on for years. And I just couldn't muster up the courage to tell her. It, you know, it it's not an easy conversation, and I mean, when I say I had anxiety attacks, I had anxiety attacks. I mean, there were times on tour where I was just like, I don't know, just like hyperventilating for no reason. And when it's just something that lived in my mind for so long. It's just something that it would come back and just haunt me, and I would just think about it all the time. Like, I can't believe that I did that. Um, but came a point where I truly knew that I could not enter into a marriage with her without her knowing this. Um, I also knew that telling her could potentially end the relationship. But again, I had to do what was right. I couldn't enter into this covenant relationship on this big lie. And so I told her, and we both cried together. And amazingly, she forgave me. She wasn't thrilled about it by any means. It's not like she was in a good mood. Um, but ultimately, she forgave me, and I proposed not too long after that. And 12 years later, we are still together with two amazing little boys, Asher and Nolan. And the Lord's grace is truly amazing. So, you know, but now I mentioned earlier that I still had pretty bad depression, even thoughts of suicide. And that was even after getting saved and getting married and having kids. I think the fact that I was married with kids now weighed on me more than anything prior to that. Like, I had to provide now. I had to be there for everyone financially and spiritually and just emotionally and personally. And I felt like I was like failing literally everywhere on every one of those points. And I still don't feel like I'm hitting them perfect. And nobody, well, maybe not nobody, but nobody that I've talked to feels as though they're hitting the mark. So I was still struggling with anger and resentment that I had pent up for such a long time that I really had never dealt with. We would get into arguments that would turn into all out wars where I would be screaming and eventually stormed out, not to be heard from until I came back home. Uh, I didn't ever want to talk about anything. I wanted everything to be swept under the rug and forgotten about. I didn't want to talk about it. I wanted to move on. Forgive and forget, right? Well, my wife doesn't work that way. Her family would talk about disagreements or fights they would have almost immediately afterward. They would lay it all on the table and just hash things out. They would get into a disagreement, and then soon after, like, all right, everybody gather together. We're talking about this. My family would just forget about things and pretend like they never happened, and just allow more resentment to build up. So that the fireworks were even more extravagant the next time around. So I had a lot of learning and growing to do, and still until this day, I struggle with being a good communicator. I'm much better than I used to be, for sure, but still not the greatest. And all of this anger and resentment and feelings of pain and inadequacy, they left me feeling just completely alone and hopeless. I oftentimes thought about how I could it's like I would think about how I could end it without leaving a big mess, or for anything to clean up, like a cleaner scene for somebody to find, right? I like I thought about how I would write in a note, like what would I write in a note for loved ones? What would my last words be that they read? And ultimately what it came down to for me was the thought of leaving my wife and kids with no one to fend for them, the thought of them having no one to provide a place to live, or my kids growing up without a father or ever really getting to know me, crushed me more than the weight that was leading to the thoughts of ending it. I would get like vivid daydreams of my kids looking at me in my casket, being so confused because they were so young, but also with a sense of understanding that I wasn't waking up. I would zone out, and these pictures would play in my head all of the time. Like it was a dark place. And when I finally realized that my circumstances don't define me, and that I was a redeemed and adopted child of God, things started to change. I'll struggle from time to time, but nothing like I used to. I mean, nothing like that. My identity is no longer in how I feel about myself, or like who I was before. I'm this guy from this band. Like, that's not my identity. My identity, it's not about feeling inadequate or my past pain or resentment. My identity is in the very creator of the universe. I mean, like, go outside and look around. Look at the mountain ranges. Look at all the beautiful fields and the flowers, and look up into the night sky and in the vastness of space, and think that you're a child of the one who made all of that. The one who made me and everything else. The one that can guide me and tell me exactly what my purpose is. It's an amazing thing to let go of the burden of figuring everything out myself. If you want to know who you are and what your purpose is, then you need to go to the author, the one who has written you into history with a very specific meaning and purpose. If you don't go to God, you can't ever truly know who you are or why you're here. And if that's the case, you're destined to feel like I did, alone and resentful and hateful and angry and lost and empty. I'm I'm no longer touring full time playing music, which was my dream, and that defined me for a long time. but I feel more fulfilled now in life than I ever have. And that's because I finally leaned into the one who made me to really understand who I am and why I'm here. And if you find yourself aligning with who I was, then the best advice I can have for you is to turn to Christ. I mean, truly turn to Christ and lay your burdens at his feet. Lean into who he is and what he's done for you, not who you think you are and what you think you need to do to be fulfilled. Romans 5:8 says, "But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." We're all broken and in need of a savior, and the only one who can save you, the only one who can accomplish that is Jesus Christ. So I mean that's like my cry for everyone is to repent and trust alone in him and do it today. Um again, I don't know how long this episode is. I haven't been looking at the timer, so I apologize if I've gone longer than anybody wanted me to, but I hope this episode has been a blessing, or it's been edifying to you in some way. Maybe I've said some things that you align with, or like maybe you feel like me and you have lived the same life, I don't know, minus some details, right? Um, but now you know more about me than probably most people. But again, I think testimonies are strong. They're a strong witness to the reality of God's word and his love and his redemption. I think testimonies are great, you know, and I'd be interested to hear yours. I'd be interested to leave me some comments and let me know if there were any points that you aligned with, or if just anything that I said or have been through were encouraging in any way. But that's all I got. Thanks for listening and watching. Remember to always be ready to give an answer for the hope that is in you, to do it with love and respect, and maybe even share your testimony with some people, because sometimes seeing the power of God in your life can really make people curious. It can make them wonder. But all right, guys, I appreciate you listening. Take care.